What if South Korea gets nuclear weapons? Is it a good or bad idea? The world faces one of its most complex security dilemmas: the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Would more countries with nuclear capabilities make the world safer or more dangerous? Today, we're going to explore one of the countries that could potentially develop nuclear weapons faster than most: South Korea. With its advanced technology, strong alliances, and growing security concerns, it's a country that's been flirting with the idea of going nuclear. But is that a good or bad move? Let's dive in. The growing debate in South Korea. Recently, South Korea's Defense Minister Lee Jong-sup said that acquiring nuclear weapons might be an option to deal with the growing threat from North Korea. This marks a significant shift in South Korea's security strategy. Political leaders there, as well as experts in national security, have been increasingly discussing the idea of nuclear weapons. Even former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo suggested that there's no reason to oppose South Korea going nuclear. In fact, public opinion polls consistently show that the majority of South Koreans support acquiring nuclear weapons. But here's the catch. What's not being discussed is the cost of such a decision, both for South Korea and the world. The temptation and the risks. South Korea's desire to go nuclear is understandable, given its growing concerns about its northern neighbor and fears of U.S. withdrawal, especially if former President Donald Trump returns to power. A nuclear-armed South Korea could lessen the burden on the U.S. military and free up American resources to focus on China. But before diving into the nuclear arms race, policymakers need to carefully consider 5 critical questions that could reshape the global balance of power. The answers might reveal that the benefits of nuclear proliferation don't outweigh the risks. 1. What would South Korea need to build a nuclear arsenal? To match North Korea's nuclear capabilities, South Korea would need at least 50 nuclear warheads, plus the ability to quickly produce more. The challenge? South Korea's geography. Due to its size, submarine-launched nuclear missiles might be its only viable option. However, acquiring such technology is expensive, and the process could take over a decade. During this period, South Korea would be vulnerable to attacks from its adversaries, North Korea and China. This window of vulnerability would put South Korea at risk of significant setbacks if its enemies decide to act. 2. Who protects South Korea? During this vulnerable period, while South Korea builds its nuclear arsenal, it would naturally rely on the U.S. to protect it. However, this creates a dilemma for Washington. After spending decades trying to prevent nuclear proliferation, the U.S. would now be asked to protect a nuclear-armed South Korea, a country that no longer needs U.S. defense. Would the U.S. public and Congress be willing to risk American lives to defend a nation that, by going nuclear, could undermine the very security arrangements that have been in place for years? 3. Could South Korea's nuclear arsenal lead to more war? History shows that nations with nuclear weapons are often involved in dangerous standoffs. The Cold War was full of moments where the U.S. and the Soviet Union came to the brink of nuclear war, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Similarly, after India and Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons, they fought a war in 1999 and nearly went to war again in 2001. South Korea's nuclearization could trigger a similar escalation, with North Korea and China taking aggressive measures to prevent its nuclear ambitions. South Korea, in turn, might be tempted to take more risks, knowing that its security is in its own hands now. This increase in tension could easily spiral into military conflict, drawing the U.S. into a confrontation that nobody wants. 4. Would the U.S. sanction South Korea for going nuclear? If South Korea went nuclear, the U.S. would be legally bound to impose harsh sanctions. These sanctions could include military and economic penalties, restrictions on foreign aid, and bans on nuclear technology sales. It's difficult for any nation to avoid detection while building a nuclear program, so South Korea would face massive repercussions. These sanctions would not only hurt South Korea, but could damage its economy. China, already a strong economic partner, would likely retaliate, as it did in 2016 when South Korea deployed a missile defense system against China's will. The economic impact of nuclear proliferation could be catastrophic for South Korea's financial markets and international relations. 5. What would South Korea's nuclearization mean for global non-proliferation? If South Korea were allowed to develop nuclear weapons, it would set a dangerous precedent. Currently, only 9 countries possess nuclear weapons, thanks to decades of international non-proliferation efforts led by the US and the Soviet Union. However, if Washington turns a blind eye to South Korea's nuclear ambitions, other countries might follow suit. Nations like India, Saudi Arabia, and Australia could push for their own nuclear programs, which would only increase the risks of global instability. If other powers, like China and Russia, help these countries acquire nuclear weapons, the world would enter a dangerous new phase of nuclear competition. Conclusion: a dangerous path ahead. In conclusion, while there are valid arguments for South Korea to acquire nuclear weapons, the risks are immense. The first few decades of a nuclear-armed South Korea would be the most perilous, as both South Korea and its adversaries struggle to adjust to this new reality. The rise in the number of nuclear-armed nations increases the risk of arms races, crises, and the potential use of nuclear weapons. This would make the world a far more dangerous place, not just for South Korea, but for everyone.